Today, we journey back in time to the old Hawaiian sugarcane days, a time when these trains right behind me were transporting things such as sugar, molasses, and wartime cargo. We'll also get a VIP tour of one of the trains and a look into the Hawaiian Railway Society. While the state of Hawaii actually owns the tracks, the Hawaiian Railway Society continues to act as the caretakers here. They offer Sunday excursions that are a whole lot of fun, and I would definitely recommend them. If you want more information, feel free to check out their website.
My name is Larry Howard, and I'm the Vice President of the Society. I'll start with Hawaiian Railway Society. That's our society, and that was started in 1970 when they discovered that the trains were going to disappear off the island of Oahu. A guy named John Knaus was kind of one of the ringleaders. He was working up at Lualualei, and when he found out that that was happening, he got involved and started the Hawaiian Railway Society, and even they came down here and got this property from Campbell Properties, and we purchased the property about 5 years ago, so the society owns the property here and the shed along with it.
To truly appreciate what the Hawaiian Railway Society is doing out here, it's important to know about the railroad's history.
Dillingham started the railroad in 1889, and it lasted as a common carrier mainline railroad up until December 31st, 1947. And
if you go back to the ORNL, the Oahu Railway and Land Company, that started in 1880s on a grant from King Kalakaua. And they started down at downtown Honolulu, right near Ala Park, and the station. In fact, one of the stations is still there. And he started the railroad out this way because he needed transportation to be able to come from downtown to this area and do his farming that he wanted. And from there it continued on all the way up around the Waianae coast, Haleiwa, up into Kahuku, and that was the other terminus on it up there. And then a spur eventually came out and went up to Schofield Barracks and Waiawa.
Can you tell us about your father and his position at the railroad?
He was an engineer. He drove the train.
And do you have memories of him working over there? Did you ever go and visit?
Of course. We lived right across the street. So Mom always knew where we were, though, in the afternoon. Because the siding, the train came into a siding where the bridge went up. And that's where we got into the train, and then the train backed into the roundhouse. And yeah, we were always down there. They have the train goes into the roundhouse. It's round like a swimming pool, and then they have a track going. And then when they want to, there's all these different roundhouses. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. So when he got to polishing his train, and they put the train on that track, and then they'd turn things so that whatever roundhouse they wanted to get it in, this thing would turn, and then they never left the trains out at night. Ben Dillingham started the railroad. It was his pet project. My dad's whole family worked on the railroad. Every one of the brothers and the father.
Did you go all the way to Kahuku on the train?
No, my brothers did. They wouldn't take us because they slept overnight. And then they came back the next day with all this loads of pineapple in the back of the train. All this whole line, because during the summer especially, all the canneries were there.
Mr. Dillingham wanted transportation between downtown and basically out here, so that he could make this land worth something, since he was leasing the land. So that's where it started. Well, then he came to discover that the sugar mills that were out here along the way, he could begin hauling raw materials from the sugar mills down to the docks.
when Dillingham started the railroad, there was no real need to have a railroad in Hawaii. So he invented one. And the name of the railroad gives it away, Oahu Railway and Land Company. The railroad was a part of a much larger enterprise. It was probably the most visible part, but the company, ORNL, had ranches, dairies, was a housing developer, Pearl City Peninsula is probably the crown jewel of that. When the railroad began its first couple of miles, there was no traffic. I mean, what do you need to run a railroad? You have to have a need. You have to have freight. You have to have traffic. You've got to have something to carry to make money. You got to have a revenue. And none of that really existed. Dillingham had a big dream though, and it involved the land areas, Pearl City, sugar plantations. He was part and parcel with Eva Plantation. He had a hand in Oahu sugar and created the need for the railroad in parallel with creating the railroad. And keep in mind, we're the Hawaiian Railway Society, not the Oahu Railway Society. So although we concentrate a lot on the Oahu Railway and Land Company, we also are engaged in study of the plantation railroads, the Kahului Railroad over on Maui, Hawaii Consolidated Railroad. Each island had its own trains, and each one was distinct and different from the next. It's a fascinating history.
We used to ride it too, and then when we there's some area in Iwalei you have to cross the street, and there was always somebody from the company there, so my dad would say, get on the floor. So we'd go down until we passed him, then we could get up again.
Each plantation had their own railroad, completely separate from this. And here in our yard, we have a bunch of different pieces of equipment. In fact, when you come into the yard, there's a little locomotive called Eva 1, and that's one of the plantation locomotives from the Eva plantation. And then on our kind of motto is Waco 6, Waialua Agricultural Company number 6, and that was another plantation locomotive from Waialua up on the North Shore there, and then it became a general cartage where they picked up all the different stuff for the different villages and the towns and stuff, and then transportation, and it went on from the 1880s on to about 1947 was the last scheduled ride of the ORNL. A million plus passengers, including troops and others, rode it during World War II, so it was a big means of transportation during World War II. Where we're sitting right here, the main track sits behind us about 100 yards. That is the actual track that was put in the 1880s, and on the other side, directly in front of me, is old Barbers Point Naval Air Station, and that was here, so it worked to feed a lot of the military bases, as well as the sugar cane, as well as the farming and the different communities on Oahu.
It was not the only common carrier. There were 7 other common carrier lines on the island at the time, and 40 privately owned sugarcane trains.
And the little plantation ones were kind of interesting because they had something called snap track. And
they actually had fixed railroads, narrow gauge also like the ORNL main line, but in order to get into the field, they would use snap track like this, and they would run this from the harvest site down to their line where the locomotives would be in the larger cars.
Something about 8-foot sections that 4 guys could pick up, and they'd take it out and they'd cut a swath through the sugar cane and
move the sugarcane cars along track like this, which is the same gauge, down to the main, where their railroad locomotives would be waiting.
Load them up, take the trains up, pick up the snap track, move to another section and do it. That's how they harvested their cane back in the earlier years. As far as the sugar cane companies, they actually stopped using it earlier than that because they used big turn-halls and stuff, and then they didn't have to set the tracks down in the middle of the sugarcane fields. They could just go in, load it up, and move on to the next field. So
I don't think they'll ever open that railroad again. When the trucks came in, that was it. The railroad closed down.
By the 30s, the passenger traffic was much, much decreased, and they converted a lot of their passenger cars into freight cars. And as we approached the World War II era, the railroad was operating at a profit, which it did for its entire lifespan, but was hauling primarily sugar, pineapple, some equipment, some machinery, had a sweet deal with Schofield Barracks early on. It would haul feed and supplies from Honolulu Harbor to Schofield Barracks. And the feed, of course, was for the mules and the horses. And then it would haul the manure from Schofield Barracks back down and would sell that to the plantations as fertilizer.
This is a U.S. Navy boxcar. It says U.S. Navy in Oahu. This was, I think, built in probably the 1930s, used out here for hauling the military during the Second World War, used it a lot to haul munitions and other supplies and stuff to the different bases around here on Oahu.
But once we approached World War II, the newest locomotives the ORNL had were made in 1925-26. They were the Alco 2A2 Mikados. And by the time 1941 rolled around, I mean, they're already over 20 years old. The railroad looked at buying new equipment, looked at upgrading, they looked at a whole bunch of different things, never took any action. And by the end of the war, they had to make through all those years with what they had. Everything was just worn out, tired, decrepit, falling apart. Well, during the war years, with the massive amount of troop movements and hauling things for the military, they did quite well financially. That ended overnight. There was nothing left. Everybody had their cars, they had buses, they had taxis, they had the streetcars. They didn't need the ORNL for transportation. They really didn't need them for freight even. So in a meeting with or a supposed meeting, we don't know this to be a fact as yet, in a meeting with the plantation that are along the line, the ORNL said we need a rate increase, and the plantation said no. Well, without a rate increase, with the equipment condition that it was, they were forced to abandon the main line. They just could not maintain operations, but they didn't have sufficient income to keep going. And they were the first railroad to actually start a containerized freight operation. The results of which we see in Hawaii now. You know, ship after ship full of containers comes rolling in. And in the early 50s and late 50s, those were actually carried by train around downtown to the various warehouses where they were offloaded. The advantage to that is it does provide us some protection against development.
Yeah, back in when the society started in 1970, then there was a lot of people wanted to, you know, hey, come in, get rid of that, we don't want that, we don't want that. So a couple of the members started right away working to get the rail put on the National Historic Register. And it was done in, I think, about 1975, I believe. And we have 16 miles or 17 miles of track from Lualualei to Fort Weaver Road. Now, to be honest, that's on the National Historic Register. If that wouldn't have happened, we wouldn't have any rail left. When they put Ko'olina in, one of the things the guy said, we're not going to have trains there, and he pulled it all out. Well, it cost him a lot of money to put it back in because it had been on the National Register. So.
The disadvantage is that we have a strict set of guidelines we have to conform to. For instance, the right-of-way is on the National Register of Historic Places. Our choices are let it go and rot away, which is fine, or if we restore it, we are required to restore it to its original design. So we can't make massive improvements. We can't use concrete ties, we can't use blue rock ballast. We have to use the wooden ties. We don't use tie plates because they didn't use them when they built the railroad. We use coral ballast, which is plentiful, but blue rock is better. It's harder. So there are some drawbacks to it also. And we have to get, when we do something different, like our bridge that we constructed a few years ago, we replaced a timber bridge with a steel bridge. Well, common sense tells us, and anybody, that we have steel available. Let's build a steel bridge. It's stronger, it's safer, it'll last longer. And we had to get special permission to do that because it was not returned to its original configuration, which was a wooden span.
Okay, what I do normally on Saturdays is I'm a volunteer with a track maintenance crew. And what we do is we go out and we replace ties that are no longer serviceable to stabilize the track. Once the tie is in, we spike it into the tie to hold the rail. And then we ballast it. This is what keeps the rail or the tie stable as the train moves over. It provides support, lets it drain its rocks so the water and moisture can drain away from it. In a typical day with a crew of 4 of us, we'll replace roughly 20 ties.
The cost of a railroad is high. Everything has to be brought in from the mainland, just the way it was 100 or more years ago. Rail would have to be brought in, ties have to be brought in. One of our biggest expenses is ties and ballast. There are, if I remember correctly, 3,280 ties per mile. And each one of those ties, by the time it gets delivered to us, will range in price between $35 and $55, if my memory serves. So you can imagine the amount of cost involved in replacing these ties, not to mention the manpower involved. The mainland railroads today have all automated machinery. They run huge welded rail trains, and we do it the same way they did 100 years ago. Although we have an air compressor and a jackhammer to help, and a tie tamper now, but it's a lot of manual labor. The greatest thing that can happen to the society is to increase our body of knowledge. And there are certain things that we suspect, there are certain things that there is massive empirical evidence for, but we don't have documentary evidence. We don't have a photograph. We don't have a first-hand account. And whoever would ever see this film or any film on Hawaiian Railway, if there are pictures stuck away in a trunk someplace, or letters, information, anything having to do with the ORNL or any Hawaiian Railroad, we would be so appreciative to have copies of those documents to expand our level of knowledge.
Behind me you see we have a first-class rail car, which, as you can tell, really needs some restoration. The Hawaiian Railway Society has worked so hard repairing the tracks, repairing the different cars, as you've seen. So if you guys have any time and want to help out, please contact them, because it's such a beautiful thing and a great opportunity.